we are back with more episodes of Cannabis in Your Body with Dr. Miyabe Shields. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I am doing excellent, and thank you for coming back. It has been a popular series, but I'm selfishly starting off with my own questions.
All right, hit me.
All right. So in the previous episodes, you had mentioned that, cannabinoids work as retrograde signals and travel backwards from the postsynaptic side to the presynaptic side. Now, all those big words fascinate me, but the first thing was it works as a retrograde signal. Can you maybe explain what that is and the frequency of things we see working this way?
Yeah. So, to my knowledge, the endocannabinoids are the only retrograde signalers in terms of like major neurotransmitters being like molecules that our brain uses to talk to itself. And when we say retrograde, we mean backwards. And the big words there, postsynaptic and presynaptic, they mean post and pre, like after and before, right? Like you have like a post dinner drink is afterwards, right? Versus like a pre-dinner appetizer is before. So postsynaptic and presynaptic, it's before and after the synapse. And the synapse, and I was always taught in biology, it never left. I taught that the synapse, like snaps, like synapse, is where two brain cells meet.
Okay.
So that's the synapse. So when you're saying postsynapse, you're saying the one after it meets. And if you say presynapse, it's the one before, because almost all neurotransmitters, so with the exception of the endocannabinoids, but like serotonin, dopamine, like GABA, glycine, initially when we were first researching them and discovering them, we found that they all signaled in one direction. It was like a one-way street. So everything, when you have a brain cell, it's kind of, if you think about it, it's like trees and roots, right? Or like branches and roots, if it's like a tree. If a brain cell was shaped like a tree, the branches with the leaves and stuff, that would be like the receiving end. And then the roots would kind of be that, I should reverse that because trees take in stuff from the roots. So the roots would be the receiving end, and then the branches and the leaves would be the sending end. But it's kind of like a one direction thing in our brain cells where we receive signals and send signals in one direction. If a brain cell is going to, like, say, send a serotonin signal, it will get activated like at the roots. And then that signal, it's called an action potential, will go all the way through the brain cell and then up when it's at the leaves, when it's at the sending side. That is when it will release the serotonin. Now, that one is called pre-synapse because it is the one releasing. And it will be right up next to another brain cell that will receive that serotonin. So it's lined up kind of like branches to roots, right? And then that receiving side, that's called the postsynapse. So everything goes in one direction. And the reason why the endocannabinoid system is retrograde is because it goes in the opposite direction of everything else.
Why? I mean, that's kind of an odd thing, right? Is there an answer to why? I love
Okay, so
open-ended questions.
I feel like you're asking like the greater powers that be, like why is life life? No, so it's interesting. Like my leaning towards answering that is that something had to be. Okay,
It's
so
good answer too, though. Chaos
like
theory.
I mean it's just a theory, but let's see. Okay, so all of these systems are ancient. They've evolved, from when we were a single cell and we didn't have to communicate to one another. And it over a long, long time, they've evolved different roles for one another. And these systems have evolved. And when you look at how everything else is kind of going in one direction, like let's say, for example, if it was a telephone and you had telephones lined up, listening end to speaking end, listening end to speaking end, and one of those telephones is being too loud or it's talking too much, you need to have a way to go the opposite direction and tell it to be quiet. you have to
Right.
you have to find a way to regulate it. And that's my opinion for why the endocannabinoid system is the most important system. I'm biased, right? I've studied the endocannabinoid system. It's my obsession. But that's one of the reasons why I think it's the most important, because it's a major regulator. It's like a master controller of some of these other systems. It's not to say that they don't all participate within one another, But in general, the endocannabinoid system is responsible for regulating the activity, specifically like the overactivity or the hyperactivity of other systems.
And so is that kind of how THC and like CBD and basically any cannabinoid works through the system? Is it's going against the flow to alert another system that, be quiet or tone down?
Yeah, it's hard to. So, in terms of THC and CBD, like when we take what are called exogenous molecules, things that come from outside our body, versus anandamide, right, which is endogenous, the endocannabinoids from within. When we take molecules from the outside of our body, they're not necessarily going in any direction because they're just sort of they go from our blood and then they enter our brain and then they're just interacting with what they interact with. But what they do in terms of quieting, and it's called inhibitory, actually, is the technical term for the type of activity that they have. Although for CBD, it's complicated because CBD also interacts with the serotonin receptor and it turns it on. But this is what they're doing. They're acting upon these receptor systems and kind of hijacking our natural reason for having them and mimicking. They mimic the things that our body makes already. So it's almost like they're tricking our body into thinking that there's anandamide here or there is serotonin here.
And you've mentioned the serotonin receptor system, and you've also mentioned dopamine. Now, with cannabis, I will just throw out THC. A lot of people will associate that with like a happy feeling that serotonin produces, and there's a lot of prohibitionists who think dopamine, dope, heroin, marijuana, all the reefers. So they're actually separate systems. Does cannabis, or how do they interact, like cannabis and serotonin, or do they interact?
They definitely do interact, and the systems interact. So when we discovered all these systems, we separated them based on what their like number one thing that they interact with is, right? So the endocannabinoid system is named that way because the number one thing that we found that interacted with it was THC. And just like the opioid system in our brain was like the word endorphin, which is what interacts with the opioid receptors. Endorphins we make, right? Like we make them. It actually stands for endogenous morphine.
Wow.
It's like a shortened version of that. A lot of the early discoveries of neuroscience were done through the active molecules that we had from plants. And then with the serotonin and dopamine receptors, they were some of the earliest things that we characterized. And they were named that way because that was the primary thing that they interacted with. But the more and more we've researched them, the more that there's this like heavy overlap. So different parts of the brain, you're going to have different receptors that are there. You're going to have they are systems in that not all brain cells have all of them. So some parts of your brain are going to have more serotonin receptors. Some parts of your brain are going to have more dopamine receptors. Almost every part of your brain has endocannabinoid receptors. But it changes depending on the type of brain cell, because we have more than one type of brain cell, the part of your brain, et cetera. And how cannabis interacts with these other systems is really complicated. And we're just in the very beginning of understanding that, because we used to study, how do these molecules directly attach to these receptors, which we also call them targets. Like the molecules have targets in the body. And we used to study just that, like how do these molecules interact with these targets? But what we've found is that actually there's all of these downstream effects that happen. An example of this is like if you modify the serotonin system by taking an antidepressant, an SSRI, you will change your endocannabinoid system. Usually it leads to higher levels of endocannabinoids. And there's a bunch of different crosstalk. This is called a crosstalk between the systems that are, in the very, very infancy of being evaluated. We know that it exists, and we know that it exists in a way that is both universal in that all of us have some forms of crosstalk, but it's also likely that it's highly individualized. There's a couple early papers on changes in serotonin system receptor densities when you chronically use cannabis. And there's a couple papers on I believe that it's specific subtypes of serotonin receptors too, okay. Which the interesting one is it's the psychedelic ones. So that always was interesting to me, since there's, a synergy there. But
we have receptors is what I just heard, but I'm sorry, carry on.
I was sorry, 2A and 2C, those are the two that are linked, and they've been shown to actually combine with the CB1 receptor. And then when they get this combination, they signal differently. And, this is called heterodimerism, hetero meaning different, dimer two. And again, this is all stuff that's very early in terms of, how does this mechanistically even make sense? And we are reaching a point in our technology and our ability to actually see these, slight and minute changes, because we're zoomed in so small right now. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think like the amount that I can stress of like how minuscule a molecule is, it's hard to conceptualize, like the millions that would go into it, right? Like, if you were to take me and make me as tall as an Eiffel Tower, then a single cell in my body on average would probably be the size of like a screw head.
Oh,
like,
geez.
Right? Very, very small. And then if you were to take that screw head and blow that up to be the size of an Eiffel Tower, then the receptors would probably be like a sheet of paper or something like that. Yeah, they're very, very tiny. And I've done the analogy with like the earth and the world before too. And I believe it's that the receptors are about the size of a yacht. But the problem with that analogy is that some people are ridiculous and have ridiculous sized yachts. So that analogy doesn't always hold up.
Bezos does not apply. But that actually, that confirms the analogy I had in my head. Because when you're looking at things over time, the technology always increases and you're able to go infinitely closer and closer and closer. And that's when you discover, hey, that one thing is 100 things. Those 100 things are 1,000,000 things. And we could obviously apply that towards our body and these systems as well. But I do find it fascinating that there is an interaction kind of between all of them. And I know I'm going to have a question in the future about the serotonin levels and cannabinoid presence. So warning.
Yeah, I'm going to have to do some digging to see if there's been more recent studies that have been done on it, but it's very difficult because we don't have a good baseline, let's say, for like many people have differences in different expression levels, we call them, of all of these receptors. And there are so many variables that go into, when they're expressed and where and why, because our brain is always turning things on and off. Like I think I say it all the time, like we are always in transition from what we were 1 second ago to what we're going to be 1 second from now, from what we were yesterday to what we're going to be tomorrow, from what we were last week to what we're going to be a week from now. Our brains and bodies work on many, many different timescales to be adapting.
So would that mean that the level of CB receptors in our body is really kind of a constant state of flux? It's never fixed?
Pretty much all receptors are always being recycled, same as like our cells, right? I mean, like, when you exfoliate your skin because your skin cells die, and it's in a similar fashion that our receptors are not like infinite, and they're not immortal. They get recycled. They get it's called endocytosed. They get drawn back within the cells. They get broken back down into their basic parts, and sometimes they get put back together and put back up, and sometimes they don't.
Geez, another way that soil and the body are similar. That is awesome. I love the connection here.
It's a resource. It's a resource tool.
Yeah. Well, talking about endocannabinoids in general and with the serotonin and dopamine, you have also mentioned the endocannabinoid dome previously, and you kind of touched on a little bit of it, but maybe can you expand what that meant to you and how that I don't know, would relate to us as individuals?
Yeah, I think the best explanation for that would be the TRPV1 receptor specifically, and its name, I always find it TRPV, transient receptor potential vanilloid receptor. So it has a very unsexy name,
I'll take your
but
word for it.
it is the receptor that is responsible for spicy peppers. So if you
Hmm.
like spicy, specifically like jalapeno, habanero, but also like ghost pepper, like
Yeah.
hatter, like the hatter peppers, chocolate peppers, like the capsaicin that's in those peppers that's spicy is responsible for activating the TRPV1 receptor. It also interacts with endocannabinoids, and it's also been shown to interact with some of the rare cannabinoids. And there are a couple other in that same family of TRP. So the TRP um, families, because there's TRPA, there's TRPV. The TRPVs, I think 4 is another one that's been shown to be involved with endocannabinoid signaling. And this one has to do with energy metabolism. They're these really fascinating receptor classes. They're huge. They're not the same as the cannabinoid receptors. And they measure a lot of different things. So, I always equate them with the spicy of chili peppers because people have experienced what it feels like to activate the receptor. If you've ever eaten anything spicy, like that is what is happening. And that receptor, though, is in your brain, it's in your body. It plays an important role in pain sensation. And it does more than just that. And I think it's part of the endocannabinoid dome. Now, there's other proteins in the body. So we talk about receptors. They are, receptors. You're thinking at them as like little machines, right? Like little, like they're small, tiny, microscopic things in our body that are doing tasks for us, essentially. There are other things, other proteins, other targets for drugs in our body that aren't receptors. There are enzymes. Enzymes are best known as like metabolizers. So for people who've ever gotten a prescription and it says on there, like, do not drink grapefruit juice with this, that is because grapefruit juice has a molecule in there that interferes with an enzyme. This enzyme is the one that is responsible for breaking down the drugs. It's called the CYP enzymes, and it's a big family, and it breaks down most drugs. So if you have grapefruit juice and it stops that enzyme from breaking down the drug, then you might end up having too much drug in your system. And that's why they say not to do that. So there are enzymes within the endocannabinoid system. The main 2 are MGL and FA, but there are these other enzymes that are, so I researched one called ABHD6, another very unsexy name. There's ABHD12. There's all these other little machines that are tangential, that are performing chemical reactions that are part of the endocannabinoid system that, aren't usually given that priority of saying, they're the central part of the endocannabinoid system. They're usually more often referred to as, part of the endocannabinoid system, or, interacts with the endocannabinoid system. And it becomes difficult when you are trying to say like, oh, this is part of this one system. And yet so many things in the body interact with many, many things. There are carrier proteins. They're little baskets. So, how oil and water don't mix, yep. Right? You know how cannabis and water don't mix? Well, I mean, all the bubble hash people are going to be like, I mix it all the time. And it's like, yeah, but you don't, right? It doesn't dissolve. Like the cannabinoids don't dissolve in the water.
Right.
And so you have to have things in the body that transport those molecules around, because we are mostly water. Like our bodies are made up of mostly water. And so there are these little basket proteins called fatty acid binding proteins, FABPs. And, they've been shown to shuttle around both endocannabinoids and phytocannabinoids. like CBD, THC. They're not necessarily included in part of the endocannabinoid system, though, because they shuttle around other things too, right? Like, so that's kind of what I was saying when I was mentioning the endocannabinoid dome. I was kind of just describing all of the things in the body that potentially interact with the endocannabinoid system or with cannabinoids, and that there are these other sort of support aspects of the endocannabinoid system that are shared across a larger, space of fat signaling and fat metabolism and really just the fatty things in our body. But there's still stuff that's getting discovered today. I mean, we're still, it's a really exciting time. We're doing more research on cannabis than ever before. And that's awesome. And oh, sorry, go ahead.
And in a meaningful way, we're not just looking for damaging results. So
exactly for the first time pretty much ever.
Yeah. That huge plus.
Yeah, exactly.
That's interesting. I didn't really consider, how they move through the system and that we are mainly water. And again, that brings me back to the farming side, which I know it's like chelators for nutrients, certain nutrients. It actually like encapsulates them and allows them to get into the plant and move around. So it's like we've got natural chelators.
That's really, really similar. It's like a bigger thing than that, right? Because chelators are for, if you imagine chelators being for like one ion, right? Like a metal or a nutrient. This is like the THC molecule is huge. I think it's over 30 something. Maybe not. It's like 23. It's a bigger though than one ion. So if you imagine it, instead of it being like a chelator, of it being like, but it's the same thing. It comes and it makes the outside able to be transported while the molecule is kind of like safe within. It's very similar to nanotech, actually. Most of the nano emulsions and nanotech stuff that you see with like the quick onset and that sort of stuff is done in a similar way. They either create small little particles where the cannabinoids are inside, or they bind it to something like a sugar or something. And that is how it gets dissolved.
That's interesting because I always like to be a naysayer of things. Of like, that's marketing. But that's one that I have personal experience with that I was like, I think there is something different to it. I do notice something different. So that was an interesting one.
I do. And there are differences between, I was laughing about it. Riley and I were laughing because we're like, everyone has a salad dressing story, right? Like if you've ever tried, right? If you've ever tried to make a salad dressing with cannabis infused olive oil, you like surprisingly end up, overdosing yourself.
I'm gonna cry over here.
Salad dressings are emulsions, so they're not nanoscale; they're like micro scale.
Okay.
They're bigger droplets. But oh man, I'm pretty sure everyone has a salad dressing story. If not, when you try it out, be careful because it's an emulsion.
I take that as a personal challenge.
So. You have to get back to me on it, like. Yes. No, it's like olive oil and anything for the most part, but the like immersion blenders, I mean, then you got an emulsion right there. I mean, it'll re-separate itself out over time, but
right. I'm gonna loop this and go into the kitchen. Oh man. Now sorry. That's dangerous. Okay. So getting back to the studies, though, you were kind of talking about, we're able to do positive studies. Have there been any studies that you've recently found since we've last spoke that you're just like, gosh, this one's interesting?
I've seen quite a few, but some of the ones that are really sticking to me have to do with like differences in like, there's been one that I saw was a poster session. So it wasn't a formal publication, but it was a quantification of new molecules that were only in outdoor grow. And it was done with clones. So essentially it was like taking clones and growing them in, similar conditions, but you cannot replicate outside. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of the study. And it was fascinating because it was, just as very preliminary. But it was something that most people are familiar with it. And there's one other study that was done pretty recently that was also showing that like heavier terpene development, more in different terpene profiles in outdoor grows. And that was like a kind of rabbit hole that I went down for a little bit because, I do prefer it. Just personally, not that there's anything against indoor grows. I also like think that that's incredible, but the feeling tends to be more mellow in my opinion. And,
Mhm.
I was also, I was also going down a dive of, there's some more interesting conversations coming about now too when it comes to cannabis use disorders, like what qualifies as a cannabis use disorder and what demographics. And there was one paper, and it's not necessarily, it was just interesting to me. It was studying medical students, and it said that surgeons or people who were going to become surgeons were more likely to be alcoholics or more likely to drift towards alcohol, and primary care physicians or people who were interested in being
No,
primary care physicians were more likely to use cannabis. And it was, it was just like one study, but I was like,
that's awesome.
that's like that was just such an interesting divide, and fascinating, just because it was medical students, and it was, I think the cohort was like followed for like 4 years. But I've always in my mind known, there are like, there's a funny post I saw where it was like, yeah, can we get less stimulant people in politics? Let's dial down the stimulant type people that are in politics, and let's get more of the weed people in politics. And it's like, meanwhile, the weed people, we're all just like chilling, and we're like, we don't want that
We're
involvement.
good.
No, I just thought that study was interesting for that reason. Not saying that I dislike people who don't use cannabis. That's not what I'm saying whatsoever. I have
No.
friends who don't use cannabis, but not many.
But I'm sure that we both agree cannabis isn't for everybody, but it's for a lot
No,
more people than are aware of it. So that's
I
why we
mean,
do this.
absolutely. It's nothing is for everybody either. I mean,
Yeah.
like we're all so individual, and we
Yeah.
have really, really by the time that we're older, we've gone through a lot of experiences that change the way that we respond to these molecules. So we were and when we were naive to them in the very beginning, when we've never taken them, it's very different from now, right? I mean, my brain
Yeah.
is like 18 plus years in. Like
Same.
there's no going back there. And I'm not under any, delusion or illusion that it hasn't had an effect on, how my brain developed and how it continues to develop. I'm just in the mindset that there are pros and cons to both of those things. And for me personally, like I am like on my own personal self positive, it was positive. That's not to say that that's not true for everyone and other people. And, things change and your life changes, and you could potentially have a hormonal change. You could have a life event happen. You could have different stressors come on in your life. There are tons of reasons why that could change, or why situations could change for you. So
Hey everybody, Chad Westport here. We're back with another edition of Cannabis in Your Body with Dr. Miyabe Shields. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you again for making time to join us. Help us understand the endocannabinoid system and what this wacky plant can do to and for us. So a couple of the questions that I wanted to touch on today really involves the endocannabinoid system. Previous episodes, you had mentioned that it has a high and a low point, kind of like an ocean. There's a high tide and a low tide, with the mornings being lower. And you had mentioned, this may be why wake and bake can hit people different. And I'm just like, light bulb moment. Okay. So can you tell us a little bit more about the cycle, and do we know why the endocannabinoid has a cycle?
So part of it is because the endocannabinoid system tends to follow cortisol, and that it kind of comes like right after it. And cortisol also has a cycle
Huh.
within the circadian rhythm. Now, there's been a couple studies on the endocannabinoid system and circadian rhythm, but I don't know for a fact if we know, that every single person, it's always the same. In most studies, if you look at the average like population, you'd say that it'd be lowest like right before we wake up in the morning. And then it's kind of climbing all day, and it reaches its peak somewhere like in the early afternoon. And then it starts to kind of go back down. And there's so many other reasons why the wake and bake could feel different. But I mean, a part of this could be that these molecules compete with THC. when they're present, there's going to be like a buffering effect. There's going to be a difference there. And everything in our bodies is a balance. Everything in our bodies is and a really complicated dance with what is available and what's there. When these molecules float around, like, so when we smoke, THC is going from our lungs into our brain, it doesn't just like beeline it to a receptor. It's kind of floating around, and then it finds a receptor to bind
Okay.
to. It's like, whoa, here's a
Hey,
receptor.
yeah.
And then it sticks on for a certain amount of time, and then here's a receptor. Now, that
Hmm.
amount of time that it sticks on is called receptor occupancy. So it's like it'll stick on to like a certain amount of time. Um, there are other things that could happen, right? Like, let's say it goes to stick onto that receptor, but there's already an endocannabinoid there. Then there's no place for it to bind because THC binds in the same location as anandamide. Or let's say that, it's floating around, and because we don't, there are things that we still don't yet know and understand. It's floating around in the receptor because there's endocannabinoids present. This receptor is localized maybe in a different area. There are things that we still don't quite conceptualize about it. The other one being that a lot of people drink caffeine in the morning.
Mhm.
So that's definitely another difference there because you're adding in an entire other, molecule and system and everything. And for many of us dependents, I mean, like, I will be the first to admit it. I've taken multiple stabs at cutting coffee. I have done it before, but generally speaking, if I enter into a phase of working a lot, I end up back on caffeine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Back on caffeine. It's a type of dependence that we don't really think about much, but that it definitely has an interplay. And that, these cycles in our body that happen every day, that, for some of us happen every month, that happen all the time. Like, we are always in these sort of like regulatory stages between like resting and, I think it's like usually digesting is the other one, but
Hmm.
a restful state and a recovery state, an active state and a doing things state. And I think that that's a piece of that, of that transition, is the endocannabinoid system having highs and lows. And I regularly am talking about it as the wake and bake because I think a lot of times it is viewed as a stoner stereotype to wake and bake, to be like, oh, that person's lazy, they're so
Mhm.
unproductive, they can't do anything without they wake up and the first thing they do is take a hit. Like, the first thing they do is rip a bowl. It's like, oh man, what a stoner,
Yeah. Yeah.
And like, what if you had replaced that with taking an antidepressant, which everyone takes in the morning, right?
Right.
What if you were to replace that with taking an allergy medicine? I mean, not saying that they're interchangeable because they're not. They're different molecules, different, different systems, different purposes. But that for some people, that wake and bake, if you find the right thing, the right dose, the right amount, that is what keeps you from having pain flares. That is what enables you to focus. That is what leads for you to have decreased social anxiety and be able to go and be more productive,
Yeah.
to be able to go and function better. And this is subjective, right? This is
Mhm.
something that is going to be different from person to person, and it matters what your tolerance is, and all sorts of other variables here. But the wake and bake absolutely is a different therapeutic medical purpose for many reasons, if not for also the fact that your endocannabinoid system is different, and so it might feel different.
That is awesome. And, all of those benefits that you were just mentioning, I can personally attest to those in my life. And, that kind of leads to the next question, too. I heard you mention circadian rhythm because, for many years of my life, I was a musician, I was a nightclub DJ. And I definitely have, like, my stomach has always given me issues, and it definitely has its own cycles. And there is a period like 4 to 8 in the morning is the worst, whether I'm awake or whether I'm sleeping and wake up during that period. That's always like a hard time for me, and cannabis helps in those moments. So I wonder if that's well, it sounds like that could be related, but back to my question here, circadian rhythm.
No, that sounds like it's definitely really, I mean, that's also when some people will get migraines will come on, some people will have seizures that come on in there. That is the time for me that I like will startle myself awake in like a random jolt of pain, like a random
right.
like
You don't know
stab
why. Yeah,
of pain. Yeah. And it's like, why does that hurt? And then it goes away. And it's like, oh, whoa, why did that hurt for 2 seconds? Or it doesn't. And you're like, oh my gosh, I'm in pain. But like, it's one of those things that can disrupt sleep. And that's another thing about sleep being, a really complicated thing when people ask about if cannabis can help sleep. It's like, well, sleep is such a complex thing that people have trouble falling asleep for different reasons. People have trouble staying asleep for different reasons. But definitely one of the reasons why I think cannabis is helpful for sleep has to do with this, is that this part of time when you're supposed to be resting, it's part of time when some of us are like very susceptible to things.
Very low. Now, let's say, kind of go back to the circadian rhythm. Let's say people, were like night workers and their rhythms all thrown off. And let's just even hypothesize, or let's just say that they're working at an indoor grow. So they're getting that sunlight stimulation during those night hours. Is it possible that like the ECS cycle would reverse?
So I don't know that is ever been studied. I know that there's been studies on circadian rhythm with night workers and that it absolutely disrupts like your hormone signaling throughout your day, and that there are consequences to basically altering your rhythm. I also know that some people naturally cycle in a different way. Like, so there are morning people and night people, like that very much so exists. And I don't think that there's enough to like solidly say. I would argue that like my best guess would be that it absolutely would be affected, because if you're affecting the hormones and you're affecting those other things, you're going to cause changes in all of the tangential systems, and the endocannabinoid system is very related to the hormone endocrine system. It is like, I mean, it's hard to say anything that the endocannabinoid system doesn't play a pretty vital role in. And I would hazard that, yes, it would be disrupted by changes in that. I think that there are so many large scale changes that occur. Again, sleep architecture, sleep, like just in general with like our sleep wake cycling in our functionality as, like for our bodies. Like I know I can feel it, right? Because like at some point we're going to have to start looking at all of the collective experience of everyone who's used cannabis and value it. Like at some point we're going to start valuing all of that in a different way, because we all have experience and we all have real experience, and there's tons of variables in the real world, but that doesn't mean that the information that we possess by experimenting on ourselves and in our communities like isn't valuable. So I mean, it's happening. It's happening, and I'm super grateful that I'm here for it. Like I never thought in a while, when I was like in my car, like, and when I was a teenager, like, hiding in the back, we used to like roll down our seats to like be lying, lying down in the seat, like freaking out, like not moving, being like in some random spot, being like, oh my God, am I too close? And my neighbor is going to come by. Like, I'm just like, in the prohibition, like, and so I never imagined that we would come so far in such a short amount of time in terms of like advocacy. And that's been something that I am not like, I'm still like amazed by it to this day. And I'm so grateful for it, because like I knew it when I was young. I was like, I'm definitely going to do this for the rest of my life. Like this, I knew it from the moment that I first smoked. Like that moment, it was like, yeah, this helps me. That's it.
Period. And again, you gotta admire the resolve of a person to follow through with that, and to achieve the accolades that you have achieved. So hats off to you.
Thanks.
Hey everybody, Chad Westport here, and we are back with another installment of Cannabis in Your Body with Dr. Miyabe Shields. And you know what? I'm going to take a guess and say you're having a great day. Is that true?
I've been having a good one so far, and
That's
I'm going to take a
awesome.
guess and say you've been having a great day.
My day is wonderful because we have been talking about some very important things, and I appreciate your time and the conversation. So thank you again for being here for the series.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I love I love the interface of all the questions that don't have answers. But I hope I give the best. There's no answer for that possible.
You know what? You do a good job. You give me more fuel to like research because again, these questions are just coming from my natural curiosity, and I appreciate your dedication to the art of science here. So let's get into it today because this one, this is common again. I'm so selfish here. This is all about me here. So my body, for some reason, it's in conflict with the science, but for some reason, what I am told, what is widely known, is that consumers develop a tolerance to THC over time, which would require higher doses. Now, does that mean, well, higher doses to reach the same effects? That's, I guess, how tolerance works.
Yeah.
But does that
In theory,
mean
if you can ever reach the same effects again, that's a whole nother
the
thing,
high
right?
school high, right? We all know about the high school high.
Yep.
Good point. Gosh, so smart. Okay. But what does that mean though? Like, does your ECS actually shed the cannabinoids faster? Because it's like, hey, this used to get you to, a certain place, but now it's this. So what happens to all of that?
So there are a couple of different mechanisms for tolerance, just generally. But what is usually attributed to cannabis or to THC tolerance is a downregulation or a decrease in the number of CB1 receptors. Is that if you use cannabis a lot, you're going to actually recycle and have less of those CB1 receptors. Now, then the reason why you would need more cannabis is that if there are less receptors, you need more cannabis so that those ones that are present are activated more, like more often. Because like I mentioned in one of the previous things videos, segments we were talking on, it's not like we inhale these molecules and they just like beeline. They don't have like a secret honing thing. They're just kind of wafting around and then they interact with the receptor, right? Now imagine if you had hundreds of CB1 receptors, the molecule that's floating around is going to interact with one because there's more of them. If you decrease the number of receptors that are there, it's going to take more THC molecules to be able to interact with the same number of receptors because it's all about reaching like a threshold here. There's been some studies that show, I think it might be in animal models, that if you quit like cold turkey, it takes like 2 weeks. And I think that might be where the 2-week number came from, or maybe it just came from community evidence of people taking breaks for about 2 weeks, because I think that's probably the standard. Usually I hear somewhere between 2 to 4 weeks of being cold turkey, although I don't advise that personally. And I don't take tea breaks ever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that they're necessary if you develop crazy tolerance and like, but it's kind of, in my opinion, better to just, either decrease your tolerance more slowly, something called tapering, which, would mean that you're going to have to be conscious of how much you're using in the first place, which is usually somewhere to start. But it is, I mean, I think it's pretty well understood that if we are consuming regularly, our bodies do get used to a certain amount. And especially if we're going for a specific effect that happens at higher doses. And I'm talking about like chronic pain patients, chemotherapy patients that are using it for anti-nausea effects, people who really require very high doses of cannabinoids. You do develop a tolerance in that, you can take more and feel subjectively less.
Okay. And explained, that makes sense to me. Again, you need more of the THC molecules because there's less receptors, and not because there's more, not all of them are going to find a home. There are only a certain number that's going to find a home, and that may be the approach.
Right. And then it's like if you imagine like every time a THC receptor or a THC and a CB1 receptor meet, if you imagine it as like that contributes 5 marbles to a jar or something, and you need to fill the jar to have an effect,
Okay.
right? If you had 100 receptors and 100 THC molecules, you'd get 100 marbles and you'd fill the jar, right? Now, all of a sudden, if you have 50 CB1 receptors, they're going to need 2 marbles each before they fill the jar to 100, and then you reach the effect. And it's not really well understood, like cross tolerances, but they exist, right? I think the most commonly talked about cross tolerances in the community are actually psychedelics, like between, say, like LSD and psilocybin. A cross tolerance meaning like a tolerance in one thing leading to a tolerance in another. Because an example of that cross tolerance with cannabis is anesthetics, like surgical anesthetics, which is why if you're going to have surgery, most of the time it's beneficial to, first of all, try to decrease your tolerance if you have a tolerance. But second of all, to be honest with your anesthesiologist and tell them up front if you regularly use cannabis, because you can have a higher tolerance to their anesthetic, which means that you might not be, you might not be in the right state for your surgery, which can be very, very traumatic. So,
Yeah.
um, and so there are things that can contribute to tolerance outside of just cannabis and just the cannabinoids. But for the most part, I think that in terms of shedding it, or in terms of like getting rid of it, the metabolism will stay the same. Like to my knowledge, like there isn't a huge difference in the enzymes that specifically for THC and like CBD and the cannabinoids. They're kind of like the average enzymes. They're called like cytochrome P450 enzymes, and they're this huge class of enzymes that metabolizes most drugs. They metabolize most, not just drugs, but like exogenous things, like most
Yeah.
things that come from outside our bodies. And there are things that set off the upregulation or downregulation of them. There are things that we do that will like increase the rate of them or decrease the rate of them. But to my knowledge, it isn't like that isn't the major contributing factor. The more major contributing factor is the receptors.
Okay. And that, that kind of makes me think as like a, chronic smoker person who kind of smokes all day, their tolerance break is sleep. So if like THC was present and like bound to these receptors almost in like a constant state at a constant level, would it take smaller amounts of THC to please the ECS, or is it just still actively shedding them, even receptors, I mean, actively reducing their numbers in a constant smoker?
So this is kind of a complicated sort of like influx. And I think the easiest influx and outflux thing would be like if you imagined you had a bin and you have a hose putting water in the bin, and that's you smoking. You're just
Okay.
you're putting the water in, you're putting the water in, and then there's like a funnel at the end and there's water going out, and that's the metabolism. Like there's a hole at the other end of the bucket, and that would be the metabolism or the things that are like being removed from the body. In terms of like would adding more than like have a bigger effect in terms of cannabis, that's called titration also, by the way. If you like were to take the first dose of something and then while you are still feeling that dose add more to it, that would be titrating up, increasing. So in that case you would have added water to the bucket and it hadn't fully emptied yet, and then you would add more. So yes, you can reach different effects by that way. I think that like many of us have experienced that where you've smoked once and then later in the day, or like usually if you're smoking, usually the synergy has to happen within the first hour or two, or else you've fully metabolized it.
Okay.
Because let's say that you smoked an hour ago and then you're like fully back to your baseline, like almost everything has been metabolized, then you're just kind of having a second dose. And the difference would be
Mm.
like maybe if there were any like immediate changes to your receptor levels, but I'd say it's probably more likely that the bigger changes that happen within that time frame would be something like your hormones or your endocannabinoid levels could change. But that would be different than say you smoked and within the same hour, there's still water in the bucket. There's still THC there. And then you smoke again and then you do get higher, right? Um, I I think it's subjective. It depends on what you're trying to satisfy and like what is the question of satisfaction. And I think that's really important because for every one of us it's different. Like
Right.
what what is the reason or the intention behind the cannabis and how it helps you?
Mhm.
And for some people, absolutely, like it's going to be maintaining a balance. And I know that for me, like my threshold is pretty low. But I do have this like pretty tight window where it's beneficial before on the upper end I can become
Yeah.
unproductive or I can become anxious or
Right,
like,
right, right.
and so you're kind of shooting for understanding that, that window for yourself personally.
Which is important. And I love that we're going to cover that here in just a second because that's important. And like you said, it is individualized. But that feeling of high you were just talking about, we kind of associate that with the endocannabinoid system. But is the feeling of like being high separate from the reported homeostasis aspect of cannabinoids in ECS? Like, just because I'm feeling it right now, be like, bro, I am so homeostasis. Or are they kind of
Oh
unrelated?
man, I that should be like a shirt. Wow, just homeostatic.
Yeah.
So so
But,
I feel like that's it's complicated. Certainly feeling high is feeling altered. Like we're
mhm.
altering our perspective, we're altering our systems with these exogenous, these molecules from outside the body. The cannabinoids come in. We definitely are in some ways adding to the homeostasis. Um, so I think that it's complicated because for some people and in some contexts, adding those cannabinoids in would be balancing and it would be to maintain homeostasis. An example of this could be even when we're talking about tolerance and the receptor levels. There are some studies that point to like migraines, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, and then other studies for, autism, PTSD, and alterations in your endocannabinoid signaling where you have more receptors, and that might be part
Hmm.
of this like alteration. So let's
Hmm.
say that you develop a tolerance and the receptor levels are brought back down. For me, I attribute this like when I have a low level of a tolerance, I don't dream that much. I don't have that many dreams. And I prefer that to having night terrors and not being able to sleep and jolting awake just like buckets of sweat and feeling like the grips of fear, like you're in it, because that's how it feels when you're having a night terror. Um, and I definitely attribute that effect, that night terror, to tolerance because it's not like it goes away the first time that I smoke. If I do go through a period where I don't smoke or I don't use cannabis, I think the last very significant period I've gone through was, years and years ago. And one of the things that does come back is those dreams. And I mean, I've gone to a point where I've gone like a year out. And because there is a point where there's a small amount of time where they will rebound and you're like in a withdrawal where you are like, people don't like that word in the cannabis like field, but that is what it is.
Right.
We do experience rebounding when we have tolerance, and then we stop using cannabis and our brains are going back to this like different state. But I mean, for me, it's like without a doubt. I mean, they didn't go away completely, and they completely go away and stay away when I have like a relatively low level of tolerance. Now, if that is attributed to having different levels of CB1 receptors, then it would be that, hey, this
Hmm.
is keeping them, like this is keeping you in homeostasis, right? But it's just about what do you define as that balance. And I mean, you were mentioning it being like, if you use cannabis all day and if that's the optimal, then that is homeostasis. But I'm of the point where like this is my homeostasis. Like I that just from me personally and my responding to you in a personal abstract thought of what do I define as homeostasis. For me, being balanced is being happy. It's being not stressed. It's being not inflamed. It's, you know, for me, maintaining my body's homeostasis is maintaining functionality. It's, not having a lot of chronic pain. It's not having major GI like GERD and like extreme like motility type things. Like it's having like a balance. And for me, that is being high. I mean, a different, I think I stopped viewing it that way a long time ago. It's not like I don't still get high, like that happens, like, obviously. I mean, maybe not obviously, but like I still use cannabis in ways that aren't at the bare minimum in my life. But I view that as medicinal in its own right, because, it is a different time and place for everything, but those higher doses have after effects that contribute. And anyways, long roundabout way of saying that I don't think it's everyone's homeostasis, and it's probably not the medical definition of homeostasis, but I'd argue for you and me, it definitely is the same thing.
Yeah, and because that's usually how the endocannabinoid system is approached in the cannabis world these days, is as a system that can promote the homeostasis, which again, individual, to every individual. Gosh, that was intelligent. Yeah. So kind of from there, though, we're talking about the THC can move or is metabolized in an hour or two. But what is the average window for detection in like blood and urine and these types of things? And why is it so different? And again, this will be unique to each individual. You can only give kind of a time frame window, but I'll preface it for you there.
It's so hard because it also depends on the test. I mean, so now we're talking about detection of drugs, like for drug testing purposes of whether you would test positive or not, right? And the reason why this is so difficult is because, first of all, different labs test different, like often there's like a panel of metabolites. They're not usually testing for just THC because that goes away pretty immediately. I mean, when you stop feeling high, there's not active THC in your body anymore, like for the most part. Maybe there's like trace amounts there. The half-life for THC in the body, I think, is only like an hour. It's pretty short, at least when it's smoked. When you have an edible, it's, way longer. And that's a whole different thing because of the absorption and how long it takes to absorb is a contributing piece of it. But it's not long that the actual molecule THC is in your blood. And what they're looking for when you get tested is not that. They're looking for these other they're more stable metabolites. So our body in our liver will go and take the molecule and we'll add an oxygen to it, or we'll add a sugar to it. We'll like add something to it. This makes it more stable. It also, some of it we will, excrete. We will that's how it gets out. We pee it. But a lot of it, because of the cannabinoids being so fatty, go back and get put into our fat cells and get stored in our fat. And that's one of the reasons why it can take months to clear out of your system. And I think it depends on your metabolism. It depends on the amount of fat that you have. And it depends on how often you use cannabis and to what amount, because the amount of it that goes into the fat is related to the amount of it that you put into your body in the first place. So, and the amount of it that will get cleared out of that fat has to do with the amount of it that will, that you've had to begin with. And so I've known if someone was like, I'm going to get drug tested and I'm so scared or whatever, there's tons of foolproof. There's all these things that people say that you do. And it's well, you can't dilute it too much. You can't do this too much. You can't do that. In my opinion, what I would do is I would fast so that you're running through your fat cells and drinking tons of water and working out and taking all the vitamins that are excreting. I know niacin is one of them. I've done that before.
I've done that.
Made me itchy, made my legs really itchy. It's
oh God, yeah.
I was I am certainly taking too much of this niacin. It's too much.
Golden seal from back in the day, yes.
But for some people, it can last in the body for, months because you're re-releasing it. It's called the depot effect, like Home Depot, but depot meaning instead of it being Home Depot, it's a depot for molecules. The fat acts as a depot. And then technically for hair, there's claims that it's ridiculous long times, but it also, the other thing that it depends upon is each of these testing labs has different metrics for what is and isn't false positive, false negative, and also controls on the actual test matter and all of these things. That's why I think drug testing is absolute BS. That's just my personal opinion on it. I think that we should get rid of it and stop doing it. And that's There, I mean, I know people being like, no, we want, how about this for cannabis? Let's like for cannabis. But it's also not fair for cannabis because many of the other drugs exit your system within 48 hours. I mean, they're just gone without a trace. And like those are often the more harmful substances. So it's not fair. And in also in many ways, it's not accurate because you can't really tell. There's to this day not like a super accurate way of telling if someone's high like right then.
No, no.
Like and again, like I don't care if anyone goes home and has a glass of wine. Like we don't care what happens in the I do care if someone is, you know, intoxicated while doing something that is unsafe to be doing that. Like that, you know, that makes perfect sense. But we just don't have the capabilities of testing for that for cannabis. I mean, you could smoke or have an edible on a Friday night, Saturday night, and you're likely going to test positive on Monday. Like
That's that's the thing that I wanted to get to here, because at first it sounds like they're not even testing for THC. It's a metabolite with something added on, so it's not technically THC when they said you failed for it. But
I know, but we wouldn't have those molecules in our body without the THC. So it's like they know that that's where it comes from. That's the other thing too, that we don't actually have a good like handle on differences in these rates based on like genetics. I mean, there's so much that we don't know that make testing discriminatory, like or highly likely to be discriminatory since we're all so different. And I have, you know, been extremely fortunate in my life to have never had a negative like situation arise from that. But I know so many people in my life with and the just the stress and you know everything that comes with it when this is a medicine that's just as valid. Like they would never it would just never be a thing and you couldn't even test for a pharmaceutical. It's against the law.
yeah,
Like and at least for everyone who does have medical prescriptions, it should be protected in that, you know, in that way. And then if that were the case and if it were protected, then maybe we would value the medical system more. And then maybe, you know, there's all these,
right.
you know, continued caveats for, you know, not treating something the same with the same respect that we treat other molecules.
I guess that kind of brings us to one of the the last questions, which still can consume a bit of time here. How does a person find their therapeutic minimum or the right dosage for, the right time of day to remain productive and focused? Again, like somebody who has, maybe hard time focusing a toke or two, they may be more focused. So, but that's not, again, that's not being high. So how does a person kind of maybe go about finding that threshold or the overall effects?
So this is definitely personal experimentation. Like there's starting points for a lot of things, right? Like if people were asking about edibles and if we were asking about THC, I'd be like, why don't you start at 2 to 2.5 milligrams? That's the starting very, very low dose. If we're talking about smoking cannabis, if we're talking about flower, or if we're talking about like a concentrate, I mean, we're talking like you want to be able to, first of all, you want to be able to know how much it is. That's, I should have started there.
Right.
It's in the beginning, it's mostly about knowing how much you are consuming and then what's called titrating. And that is starting with a really small amount, like less than you think is desirable, and then increasing it slowly and then reaching a point. So with edibles, titrating will be more difficult because they take so long to take an effect. And depending on if you've eaten or not, it can be difficult. With smoking, titrating is pretty quick and can be pretty quick and easy. So if you were curious about it and you wanted to start, you could weigh a joint. Like let's say the joint was like a gram. You could weigh it. You could like take one hit if you wanted to. You could weigh it again and see like how much actually was that. Or you could just, hit it once and wait, 10 to 15 minutes, be like, all right, I think maybe a little more. It's also just as a PSA, it's good to experiment on yourself in a time that like isn't when you're going to have to do something productive. It's best to do like titration type stuff and self-experimentation when you have no real obligations, so that in case you do overshoot it, you could just watch TV, or you could go for a hike, or you could play some music, or you could do something else, which is a different type of productivity and just as good as many ways. But like you could wait that 10 to 15 minutes and then see And then write it down, right? I mean, like I honed in somewhere pretty early on it being between like I did like 300 milligrams. That was like a third of a gram and a half a gram or something like that. Like, and of a blend of cannabinoids. And when I mean a blend, I mix with hemp flower. If you're using just THC flower, if you're familiar with hemp flower, it has different cannabinoids in it. You could experiment with those. And it's starting small, like starting lower than what you would expect, and then adding and increasing up. Now, if you overshoot it, that's okay. You write it down, and then the next time you do it, you look within that window right before and stop and be like, was that right? And the more times that you're doing that, the more times, like, especially if you're writing it down, but the more information that you have, also about strain specificity, like overall, like terp profile, like methods, like specifically with dabs, like I get a lot of energy. It has to be a little bit. It's great though,
Yeah.
but like there's, it's different.
Yeah.
And the more information that you have, the more of that you can kind of put together. That's how you can like discover what would be like called a therapeutic minimum, something that like maintains this level that you want with the smallest amount that you can use. And that's not to say that you have to go that little all the time, but it's more that you want to stay somewhere around there so that your tolerance doesn't get out of control and you're not just like overusing it. And then one day it comes that you really need a big effect and you can't have it because you have like a really, really big tolerance. And that, that window is going to be totally different for everyone. And I think in general, people who have chronic pain, in general tend to have high tolerances because it's a higher threshold,
Mm-hmm.
like of that effect, as opposed to people who use more for like anxiety or like focus,
Okay.
and also the sleep tolerance thing can happen pretty quickly, depending on like form factor. And I actually developed a tolerance to edibles pretty quick. I'm not like a huge fan of the way that they feel, but they're definitely convenient for discretion. If you ever are anywhere where you can't be loud,
Yes.
like
Yes. Yeah.
it's definitely useful. And I think it's all about that tracking and, finding what is going to be your way of doing it that lasts for longer than a couple weeks. Because I mean, like, you don't always, I mean, notoriously cannabis also, I'm always asked to talk about cannabis in memory and I'm always forgetting, it's like there's definitely a
Gotta
link there. And so we gotta write it down and we have to be conscious about it.
definitely write it down, be conscious because we all think we'll remember, but no, we won't. And it's easy. You don't have to try to remember it. So having like good tools for something like this can be extremely beneficial. And I know on your website, you were talking about maybe developing something like this that people may be able to use.
Right. There is a tracker and it's on my secret studio. So for people who sign up for my email list, you could be on the secret studio and it's a moderation tracker. It's just a little tool. I'm very data oriented, so I like to look at my progress as I go along, and I created this. It's an Excel sheet and it helps you put in your own data and track, and it's a starting point. And I think it could be something that could help people stick with something for 4 weeks or maybe develop something on their own that would be helpful. So, yeah, I would love to have any feedback too if anyone's interested.
Awesome. Well, I will definitely link people to that in the show notes. And actually, I probably already just flashed it below because I'm going to add it in later. Because yeah, I've had a sneak peek of this tool, and I think it's going to be extremely valuable for a lot of people. Even people, if you've been smoking for years and years and years, use this tool. You might learn something. So yes.
Or it might just be a fun way to represent your data. Oh, yeah, and you could grow little cannabis plants every day.
Yes, yeah, I do like that. And I'm a data nerd at heart. So yes, that's that. I love it. Oh, shoot. This has been awesome. And I'm sure this will spawn, even more questions and hopefully more sessions in the future with you. So I do appreciate your time today. Thank you very much. Also, always like to give you any last words.
No, I mean, I think we covered a lot of ground. Thanks so much for having me. And I always enjoy our conversations.
So, well, thank you very much. And everybody out there, thank you for watching and continuing to support this series. As always, questions for Dr. Miyabe Shields, put them down in the notes, and I will be sure to collect, correlate, and converse with her about them. 3 C's. Woohoo! All right, everybody, have a wonderful day. We will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
One, two, Westport.